François Achille Bazaine was a French general and from 1864, a Marshal of France, who surrendered the last organized French army to the Prussians during the Franco-Prussian War. He was the first marshal who had started as a legionnaire and, like the great marshals of the First Empire, had risen from the ranks. During 4 decades of distinguished service under Louis-Philippe and then Napoleon III, he held every rank in the army from Fusilier to Marshal of France. He became renowned for his determination to lead from the front, for his impassive bearing under fire and for personal bravery verging on the foolhardy. He was sentenced to death by the government of the Third Republic for his surrender of the fortress city of Metz and his army of 180,000 men to the Prussians on 27 October 1870, during the Franco-Prussian War. This sentence was commuted to 20 years imprisonment in exile, from which he subsequently escaped. He eventually settled in Spain where, aged 77, he died alone and impoverished in 1888. To the Foreign Legion he remains a hero and to this day is honored as one of their bravest soldiers. Early life. François Achille Bazaine was born at Versailles, second son of Pierre-Dominique Bazaine, a mathematician and bridge architect and engineer who was responsible for, amongst others, the building of several bridges in St. Petersburg at the request of Tsar Alexander I. His father abandoned his family just prior to the birth of Achille, leaving it without financial support. He failed the entrance examination to the École Polytechnique. Instead he enlisted in the French army as a private soldier in 1831 with a view to service in Algeria, where in 1833 he received a commission as sub-lieutenant in the Foreign Legion, it having been formed by Louis-Philippe in 1831. He rose rapidly through the ranks, through successful actions during the Foreign Legion campaign in Algeria and against the Carlists in Spain, where in 1835 he was cited for bravery and gallantry in action on several occasions and rewarded with the Cross of the Legion d'Honneur after only 4 years in the army. After serving a second campaign with the Foreign Legion in Spain in 1837–38, Bazaine returned to Algeria in 1839 and took part in the expeditions to Maliana, Tlemcen, Morocco and Sahara. He was mentioned as instrumental in the surrender of Abd el-Qadir. In 1844 he was promoted to major and then to lieutenant colonel in 1848 after 9 years' service in Algeria and Morocco, including several years heading France's Bureau Arabe as governor of Tlemcen. In 1850, he was promoted to full colonel and given command of the 1st Regiment of the Foreign Legion, based in North Africa. He married his first wife Maria Juana de la Soledad on 12 June 1852 at Versailles, Crimea in Italy. He was promoted to brigadier general at Gallipoli in 1854, en route to the Crimea, and led a brigade in the Crimean War. He fought several decisive actions at the Battle of the Alma in 1854 and during the Siege of Sebastopol, where he maintained his reputation and for which he was mentioned in dispatches on several occasions. The way in which he conducted the left wing of the French forces in the final Allied assault on Sebastopol on 8 September 1855, received acclaim of the highest order from the Allied command and he was subsequently promoted to Major General on the 22nd of September 1855 and selected, from all the Allied generals, to assume the governorship of Sebastopol. At 44, this made him the youngest general in the French army. In October 1855, Bazaine was chosen to give the coup de grâce. With a mixed French and British force, he sailed to Keenburn at the mouth of the Dnieper to attack the remaining Russian forces to the north of Sebastopol. He led a daring landing and seized the naval fortress with a frontal assault, an action for which he received particular praise. General Bazaine, who commands that portion of the French army now operating at the mouth of the Dnieper, may be cited as presenting one of the most brilliant examples of the achievement of military distinction in the modern day. At Sebastopol, on 25 June 1856, he was invested by the British Commander-in-Chief, Lord Gough, with the Order of the Bath. for his conspicuous contribution to the Allied campaign during the Crimean War. On his return to France in 1857, he was appointed Inspector General of the Army. In 1859, he commanded a division in the Franco-Sardinian campaign against Austrian forces in Lombardy. He was wounded by a shell splinter in the head on 8 June, during the action at the Battle of Melegnano. He recovered to play a conspicuous part in the Battle of Solferino, which he captured on 24 June 1859. Despite being wounded again and having his horse shot from under him, Mexico, he commanded with great distinction the 1st Division under General Faure in the Mexican expedition in 1862, where he pursued the war with great vigor and success, driving President Benito Juárez to the frontier. His decisive action was instrumental in the taking of the city of Puebla in 1863. In the same year, he was cited again for his bravery in the Battle of San Lorenzo, for which he was made Knight Grand Cross of the Legion of Honor on 2 July 1863. On 5 September 1863 he was raised to Marshal of France by presidential decree and elected to the Senate. At the same time he replaced Faure in supreme command. He personally commanded the siege of Oaxaca in February 1865. Following which the Emperor Maximilian decorated him with the Médaille Militaire on 28 April 1865. Here, as in 1870, two of Bazaine's nephews, Adolphe and Albert Bazaine Hayter, served with their uncle as his aides-de-camp. The Marshal's African experience as a soldier and as an administrator stood him in good stead in dealing with the guerrilleros of the Juárez party. But he was less successful in his relations with Maximilian, with whose court the French headquarters was in constant strife. His enemies whispered that he aimed to depose Maximilian and get the throne of Mexico for himself, or that he aspired to play the part of a Bernadotte. His marriage to a rich Mexican lady, whose family were supporters of Juárez, still further complicated his relations with the unfortunate emperor. And when at the close of the American Civil War the United States sent a powerful war-trained army to the Mexican frontier, Napoleon III commanded Bazaine to withdraw French forces and return to France. Bazaine skillfully conducted the retreat and embarkation at Vera Cruz. On his return to Paris he was feted by the public. Bazaine took his seat in the Senate as a Marshal of France and was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Guard in Paris. Franco-Prussian War. At the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, Bazaine took field command of the French frontline forces, a Third Corps of the Army of the Rhine near Metz. Nausmarchens are un désastre. It is clear even at this early stage that Bazaine was acutely aware of his army's shortcomings against the well-known speed and menacing efficiency of the Prussian military machine, evidenced by his remark to a friend whilst boarding the train from Paris to Metz. Nausmarchens are un désastre. He had absorbed certain lessons that were to become a vital part of French military thought. From the story of Waterloo he had learned that a line of resolute men on the defensive could again and again break an enemy attack. From Mexico, he had watched Lee's dashing Confederates lose a war despite their commander's brilliance in attack. He had also learned that dramatic sorties were invaluable in North Africa but were risky against European armies. Finally, Bazaine saw with misgivings the Prussian invention all-steel Krupp breech-loading gun, which was to shape the future of artillery on the battlefield. He concluded at this time that for France defensive war is better than offensive war. It is better, he said, to conduct operations systematically, as in the 17th century, takes over as commander-in-chief from Napoleon III. Bazaine took no part in the earlier battles. But after the defeats of Marshal MacMahon's French forces at Worth and Marshal Canrobert's at Forbach, Napoleon III was swift to give Bazaine the title of Commander-in-Chief of the French Army on 13 August 1870. At the time, Napoleon's choice was considered to be a wise one. It was widely believed by French politicians and soldiers alike, that if anyone was capable of saving France from the Prussian onslaught, it was Notre Glorieux Bazaine. He was the only remaining Marshal of France not to have suffered defeat at the hands of Prussian forces in the early weeks of the war. However, being the youngest of the French marshals, Napoleon's choice was met with suspicion and jealousy by the older, socially superior marshals. Hence it was with reluctance that he took up the chief command, and his tenure became the central act in the tragedy of 1870. He found the army in retreat, ill-equipped and numerically at a great disadvantage, and the generals and officers discouraged and distrustful of one another. There was practically no chance of success. The question was one of extricating the army and the government from a disastrous adventure, and Bazaine's solution of it was to bring back his army to Metz. The day after assuming command of the army, on the 14th of August at Borny, he was badly wounded by a shell on the left shoulder, a fact which was to be excluded from his service roll presented at his court-martial in 1873. Spitzeren. How far his inaction was the cause of the disaster of Spitzeren is a matter of dispute. The best that can be said of his conduct is that the evil traditions of warfare on a small scale and the mania for taking up strong positions, common to the French generals of 1870, were in Bazaine's own case emphasized by his personal dislike for the schoolmaster Frossard, lately the Prince Imperial's tutor and now commander of the Army Corps posted at Spitzeren. Frossard himself, the leader of the strong positions school, could only blame in his own theories for the paralysis of the rest of the army, which left the corps at Spitzeren to fight unsupported. Bazaine, indeed, when called upon for help, moved part of his corps forward, but only to take up strong positions, not to strike a blow on the battlefield. It seems to be clearly established that the charges of treason had as yet no foundation in fact. Nor, indeed, can his unwillingness to leave the Moselle region, while there was yet time to slip past the advancing enemy, be considered even as proof of special incompetence. The resolution to stay in the neighborhood of Metz was based on the knowledge that if the slow-moving French army ventured far out it would infallibly be headed off and brought to battle in the open by superior numbers. In strong positions, close to his stronghold, however, the scheme was creditable, and even heroic, but the execution throughout all ranks, from the marshal to the battalion commanders, fell far short of the idea. The minutely cautious methods of movement, which Algerian experience had evolved suitable enough for small African desert columns, which were liable to surprise rushes and ambushes, reduced the mobility of a large army, which had favorable marching conditions, to 5 miles a day as against the enemy's rate of 15. When, before he had finally decided to stay in Metz, Bazaine attempted half-heartedly to begin a retreat on Verdun, the staff work and organization of the movement over the Moselle was so ineffective that when the German staff calculated that Bazaine was nearing Verdun, the French had in reality barely got their artillery and baggage trains through the town of Metz. Even on the battlefield the marshal forbade the general staff to appear, and conducted the fighting by means of his personal orderly officers. Mars-la-Tour. After the cumbrous army had passed through Metz, it encountered an isolated corps of the enemy near the village of Mars-la-Tour, which was commanded by the brilliant leader Constantin von Alvensleben, and promptly attacked the French. At almost every moment of the day victory was in Bazaine's hands. 2 corps of the Germans fought all day for bare existence, but Bazaine had no confidence in his generals or his troops, and contented himself with inflicting severe losses on the most aggressive portions of the German army. Gravelotte. 2 days later, while the French actually retreated on Metz, the masses of the Germans gathered in front of Bazaine's army at Gravelotte, intercepting his communication with the interior of France. This Bazaine expected, and feeling certain that the Germans would sooner or later attack him in his chosen position, he made no attempt to interfere with their concentration. The great battle was fought, and having inflicted severe punishment on his assailants, Bazaine fell back within the entrenched camp of Metz. But although he made no appeals for help, public opinion, alarmed and excited, condemned the only remaining army of France, Marshal MacMahon's army of Chalons, to rescue Bazaine at all costs. Napoleon III, unable to sit on a horse, his face rouged, followed close behind MacMahon's doomed army in a carriage. When on the 2nd of September 1870, MacMahon blundered into a German trap at Sedan, the Emperor mounted a horse despite his pain, rode along the firing line for hours seeking death. It never found him, at last muttering that they must stop the guns, that they must cease firing, that there must be no more bloodshed. Napoleon III surrendered with 80,000 men. With Sedan, the Second Empire collapsed, Napoleon III being taken as a prisoner of war. Up to this point Bazaine had served his country perhaps as well as circumstances allowed, and certainly with enough skill and a sufficient measure of success to justify his appointment. His experience, wide as it was, had not fitted him for the command of a large army in a delicate position. Since the start of the war, Bazaine appeared to lack the appetite for the fight which had been his trademark in his military career to date. This, although imperceptible on the field of battle because his reputation for impassive bearing under fire was beyond question, was only too obvious in the staff officers, where the work of maneuvering the army and framing plans and orders was chiefly done. In spite of this, it cannot be asserted that any of Bazaine's subordinates would have done better. Siege of Metz. The Prussian army of 200,000 men now besieged the city of Metz, where 3 French marshals, 50 generals, 135,000 men and 600 guns were encircled. Bazaine attempted to break the siege at Noiseville on the 31st of August, but the French were repulsed, losing 3,500 men in the attempt. There were supplies in Metz to last no more than a month, such that by early September the order was given for work horses to be slaughtered for food. By mid-September, cavalry horses also began to be slaughtered. Without cavalry and horses to pull the guns, Bazaine's ability to mount effective attempts to break out rapidly diminished. On the 7th of October, hungry and immobilized, Bazaine dispatched 2 40,000-man foraging parties along both banks of the Moselle. But the Prussian guns blew the French wagons off the road and the Prussian infantry cut swathes through the desperate French soldiers with chassepôts. Captured at Sedan, over 2,000 men were lost in this operation. Typhus and smallpox was spreading, and by the 10th of October, it is estimated that 19,000 of the French troops in Metz were hospitalized. A further attempt was made to break the siege on the 18th of October at Bellevue, but again the French troops were repulsed with the loss of 1,250 men. The city was on its knees, the troops and inhabitants on the point of starvation. Diplomacy, then surrender. As commander of the only remaining organized army of France, Bazaine took it upon himself, perhaps justifiably, to control the country's destiny. He refused to recognize the new government of national defense, formed following the Paris revolt, and instead engaged in a series of diplomatic negotiations with the Prussian High Command and Empress Eugenie, who, with the Prince Imperial, had fled to Hastings, England. The purport of these negotiations still remained to some extent obscure, but it is beyond question that he proposed, with the permission of the Prussians, to employ his army in saving France from herself, perhaps to ignite a revolution against the government of Third Republic. When considered in light of the fact that Bazaine had long been a known Bonapartist, his actions were clearly designed to forge a way to restore the monarchy. The scheme, however, collapsed and Bazaine surrendered the Army of the Rhine, who became prisoners of war to the number of 180,000. This surrender is often explained by Bazaine's lack of motivation to defend a government that corresponded less and less to his political ideals and the best interests of France, as he saw it. At the moment of the surrender, a week's further resistance would have enabled the levies of the National Defense Government to crush the weak forces of the Germans on the Loire and to relieve Paris. But the army of Prince Friedrich Karl of Prussia, set free from the siege of Metz by Bazaine's surrender, hurried up in time to check and to defeat the great effort at Orléans.